In 1863, Peter labours as an enslaved worker on a cotton plantation alongside his wife Dodienne and their children. Upon discovering he has been traded to a new master, he shares a final moment of prayer with his family until white men arrive to forcibly remove him, disregarding the children's pleas. Peter resists, shouting and struggling against their grip, but stops when they threaten Dodienne with a gun, ultimately complying and boarding the cart willingly. Despite this, the men proceed to assault him before dragging him away. Peter and several other enslaved individuals are transported in a cage resembling livestock, and as his tearful children chase after him, he vows to return for them someday. After a long time spent on the road, they arrive at their new working location, which happens to be the construction of a railroad. The conditions here are 100 times worse than in the plantations. The heads of the slaves that dared to disobey decorate the entrance as a warning. They sleep in cages, and even while they're behaving and working hard, the white masters won't hesitate to hit them and insult them. To make matters worse, they quote the Bible to justify their actions. There are also lots of feral dogs around who are sent after any slave that tries to run away. When a slave does misbehave, sometimes they're just whipped, but other times they're shot right there in the middle of the field, and other times the boss Fassel will brand them right on the face. Fassel relies on two trusted men, Harrington and Knowles, who started as slaves but were selected to join the guards due to Knowles' exceptional hunting skills. Peter strives to maintain good behaviour, yet even when he tries to aid his fallen friend Gordon, he's reprimanded for anything outside of work duties. One evening, as all slaves are confined to their cage, they witness John being thrown in, writhing in pain from his branded cheek. Thomas, trembling in fear, is comforted by Peter, who encourages him to remember loved ones and view their circumstances as work. Peter also offers solace in the Word of God, assuring them of divine watchfulness, though John scoffs at the notion, expressing doubt in a caring God. Unfazed, Peter remains composed, promising to pray for John despite the taunting. Sometime later, Peter overhears two white guards discussing crucial news. Lincoln has issued emancipation, prompting escaped slaves to flee to Baton Rouge seeking aid. The conversation is abruptly interrupted when a guard notices Thomas's error with the food and moves to punish him. Peter steps in to defend Thomas, highlighting his youth.
He is just a child.
In response, the guard strikes Peter and aims a gun at him, prepared to execute him for insolence. However, Fassel intervenes, intrigued by Peter's demeanour, and decides to spare him. Later, when Peter returns to the cage, Fassel approaches him, asserting that he is like a god to Peter and Peter is now his obedient dog. In response, Peter retorts that if that's the case, he should be fed the same food as the dogs. Fassel merely laughs at this remark. The following day, however, Fassel chains Peter and forces him to kneel while Fassel's dog barks and growls menacingly just inches away, imprinting Peter's scent in its memory. During lunch, Peter shares the news about Lincoln and Baton Rouge with the other slaves, suggesting a path through the swamp that could be reached in 5 days. Some slaves are apprehensive due to the swamp's challenges, but Peter persuades a few that survival there is no less daunting than their current circumstances. They decide to wait for the opportune moment to escape. Sometime later, a slave dies during work, and the guards compel Peter to drag the body to a mass grave. White deserters initially assigned to this task defer to Peter, reinforcing racist attitudes. As Peter fills the pit, he realizes it's the ideal moment to execute his plan. Seizing an opportunity during a distraction caused by an explosion in the field, Peter ambushes the guards with a shovel, seizing a knife and fleeing. Witnessing this, other slaves and deserters join the escape, some engaging and incapacitating guards along the way. John secures a firearm amid the chaos. Despite the alarm raised by guards and Fassel's retaliatory gunfire that claims the lives of several deserters, Peter successfully evades capture, prompting Fassel to dispatch Harrington, Knowles, and the dogs in pursuit. Peter teams up with 3 friends and leads them through the forest, staying alert for approaching dangers. They eventually reach the swamps, where most of the group successfully crosses. However, Thomas freezes at the sight of crocodiles, allowing the pursuing dogs to catch up and attack him. Fassel recalls the dogs after they inflict sufficient harm and interrogates Thomas about their destination. Thomas, terrified, refuses to divulge information initially, but Fassel coerces him by offering a false promise of freedom. Thomas eventually reveals the group's plan, but is betrayed and shot by Fassel, who then leaves him to be devoured by crocodiles. Meanwhile, Peter, John, and Gordon safely navigate the swamp. Peter suggests continuing through other swamps, but John, confident with the stolen gun, decides to take a horse trail instead. Gordon prefers sticking with Peter, but Peter believes splitting up will make them harder to track. He advises Gordon to follow the distant sounds of Lincoln's cannons. As Peter ventures on alone, he discovers his leg is bleeding from a gunshot wound. Aware that the dogs could track him by scent, he needs to address his injury quickly, but first must create distance between himself and Fassel's pursuit. Moments later, Peter discovers a house owned by a white family that also keeps slaves. He quickly improvises a tourniquet by tying a vine from a tree above his wound and stealthily moves around, using a pile of logs for cover. He manages to fetch water from a pump and notices clothes hanging on a rope. Taking a daring risk, Peter sneaks across the garden and snatches a shirt before bolting into the forest. However, a child from the family spots him and raises an alarm by ringing a bell. Fassel hears the commotion and heads towards the house, where the family informs him of Peter's escape direction. Peter runs as fast as he can, stopping briefly to bandage his wound with the stolen shirt. He then discards the blood-stained shirt, hiding it in a trunk for the pursuing dogs to find, before submerging himself in swamp water. Fassel and his men are deceived by the ruse and head down the road, believing Peter has crossed the swamp. Once they are gone, Peter emerges from his hiding spot. Suddenly, a crocodile attacks him, prompting Peter to react swiftly by pushing it away with a thick branch and then dispatching it with his knife. Meanwhile, Dodienne wakes from a nightmare, where she saw her husband in peril. Concerned, the children also awaken, fretting over their father's safety. Dodienne reassures them, asserting that Peter is alive and will return soon because he has survived unimaginable challenges. As night falls, Peter takes refuge atop a tree, using his knife to remove swamp leeches from his body, inadvertently dripping blood on the surrounding plants. Meanwhile, Fassel and his men discover the dead crocodile, which turns out to be empty upon inspection, indicating Peter's escape route. They decide to camp for the night and feast on the crocodile, leading Harrington to compliment Peter's skills. However, Fassel quickly rebukes Harrington, citing a lesson from his father about not giving any ground to black people, lest they take more, including jobs and land. The next morning, Peter continues his desperate flight, covering his body with mud and animal waste to mask his scent despite attracting flies. When faced with another swamp crossing, he prays to his lord to allay his fear of the lurking beasts. A sudden ray of sunlight is interpreted as a hopeful sign. While Fassel divides his group to search more effectively, Peter stumbles upon an abandoned treehouse with clean water, leftover food, and hot coals. Using the coals to heat his knife, Peter cauterizes his leg wound. He then uses the coals to create smoke, scaring away bees from a hive, allowing him to gather honey. Fassel spots the smoke and heads in that direction. In the treehouse, Peter encounters a snake in a boat, carefully nudging it away with a branch before setting sail and savoring the taste of honey as he escapes. Meanwhile, Dodienne receives devastating news from her master that she has been sold and will be leaving in 2 days. Heartbroken and determined to avoid this fate, she takes drastic action by pretending to have an accident with a cotton production machine, hoping to stall her departure. Back with Fassel, he locates the treehouse thanks to his dog's keen sense of smell and continues tracking Peter's direction as he crosses the river. Peter hurries into the woods and unexpectedly encounters John, who is upset knowing that white men will now pursue him too. Peter reassures John they are not being followed and advises him on hiding their scent. but John remains skeptical. Shortly after, they hear the barking of dogs and scramble to hide, Peter inside an empty trunk and John up a tree. Despite their efforts, the dogs track John's scent, leading Fassel and his men to him. When John refuses to cooperate, Fassel shoots him down, demanding information about Peter. In a brutal turn, Fassel orders John's decapitation as a message, leaving Peter to silently mourn his friend's death. After waiting to put distance between himself and Fassel, Peter emerges from hiding during rain, only to witness the aftermath of John's execution. Grieving but determined, Peter presses on until he encounters a scene of chaos. A group of horses, one on fire, running from a burning plantation house where all the white residents are dead. It becomes clear that the slaves revolted upon hearing Lincoln's news. Entering cautiously with his knife drawn, Peter finds food and wine on the dining table and indulges until he hears a strange noise upstairs. Investigating, he discovers a dying girl trapped under a harp, playing it as a plea for help. Peter rescues her and brings her outside, but she insists he stay, giving him her cross pendant. Realizing her need for comfort, Peter prays with her. As he tends to her, Harrington approaches, forcing Peter to drop his weapon. When the girl dies despite Peter's efforts, he becomes enraged and fatally impales Harrington with the cross. Knowles arrives, attempting to reason with Peter, but Peter rejects him, claiming Knowles is the worst kind before shooting him. Hearing Fassel approaching, Peter flees into the cotton fields, shooting a dog that gets too close. Fassel finds the dead dog, intensifying his determination to capture Peter. The next morning, Peter arrives at a beach strewn with the bodies of white men who fell during clashes with Lincoln's army. Finding no provisions among the fallen, Peter spots ships in the distance and hears cannons, signs that Lincoln's forces are close. Energized by the prospect of freedom, Peter starts running but is suddenly knocked down by a horse and assaulted by Fassel. Fassel offers Peter meat and demands he beg, but Peter defiantly refuses. Fassel, asserting his dominance, aims his gun at Peter, but before he can fire, someone else shoots Fassel. As Fassel falls, Peter declares he is no god.
You are not my god.
Turning to his rescuers, Peter meets Lincoln's native guard led by Lieutenant Caillou. Exhausted and hungry, Peter is taken to the infirmary tent at their camp in Baton Rouge. Due to his infected leg wound, Peter is urged to rest by a nun nurse, spending days dreaming of his family. When Peter recuperates, he meets with a soldier to obtain his new papers as a free man, though he must fabricate some personal details like his age. Despite gaining his freedom, Peter is not permitted to leave and search for his family. The white soldiers exploit the legal ambiguity surrounding former slaves and present Peter with two options: work on federal farms or join the army. Initially resistant, Peter is persuaded by the soldiers' suggestion that joining the army could aid in rescuing his family and securing lasting freedom. Peter reluctantly agrees to enlist. After discovering Gordon among the soldiers, injured but alive, Peter feels both relief and sorrow as he informs Gordon about John's fate. He then meets with Caillou to receive his uniform, during which Caillou asks if Peter would be willing to pose for a photograph to help the cause. Despite initial wariness, Peter learns that these photographs aim to expose the harsh reality of slavery to the world. He agrees and bares his scarred back for the camera, showcasing the evidence of countless lashings. Following this, Peter meets with the general, who questions him about enemy railroad operations. After sharing his knowledge, the general remarks on the scars covering Peter's back as a sign of disobedience, a trait he perceives as detrimental in a soldier. Caillou intervenes, attempting to remove Peter from the situation, but Peter defends himself passionately, explaining that his scars are a testament to his resilience and unyielding spirit, a crucial quality for any soldier. At dawn, Caillou leads Peter and his fellow soldiers to the trenches, delivering a stirring speech about fighting for freedom. Despite facing heavy enemy fire while advancing, the soldiers press on without hesitation. Amidst the chaos of battle, Peter is struck by an explosion, rendering him briefly unconscious in a puddle. Upon regaining consciousness, he pushes through his pain, continuing to engage the enemy and offering solace to dying comrades.
Go to Mama.
Tragedy strikes as Caillou falls in battle, and Peter encounters a wounded Gordon. Witnessing Gordon's suffering and fear ignites a fierce determination within Peter. Breaking cover, he charges toward enemy lines with the intent to silence the cannons. Inspired by Peter's bravery, fellow soldiers rally behind him, overwhelming the enemy forces and achieving victory for the native guard. After the war ends, the army visits every plantation to emancipate the slaves. At the plantation where Peter used to work, everyone is initially shocked and disbelieving of the news of their freedom. However, joy and elation soon replace their disbelief as they realize that freedom is indeed real. Witnessing his former master meet justice, Peter begins a desperate search for his family, nearly breaking down when he initially cannot locate them. In a moment of prayer, Peter feels guided and discovers his wife and children beside him, running into his embrace. The photograph capturing Peter's scars becomes an iconic symbol of history, circulating worldwide. Thanks to Lincoln's Emancipation Proclamation in 1863, over 400,000 black people escaped to freedom. By 1865, nearly 4 million slaves across America were recognized as free individuals, marking a profound shift in the nation's history and the end of legal slavery. If you enjoyed this recap, don't forget to like, subscribe, share, so you never miss our future explorations of timeless classics and hidden gems. Until then, happy watching, and I'll catch you in the comments.